The term intellectual property or IP refers to unique value adding creations of the human intellect that result from human ingenuity, creativity, and inventiveness. These include trade secrets, patents, trademarks, geographical indications, industrial designs, copyright, etc. Now, before we start today's panel on IP and its role in innovation, I'd like to share an interesting incident that happened with internet giant Google with regards to IP. So, Gmail, Google's email portal, was actually barred from use in Germany since its launch in 2005 up until April 2014. It turned out that a German entrepreneur by the name of Daniel Giersch had already registered the Gmail trademark, short for his last name, in Germany way back in 2000. This was obviously much before Google had even introduced its emails. The dispute was eventually settled between Google and Giersch, but this incident just goes to show that IP issues can come and bite you even if you're a behemoth like Google. On that note, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's panel. To discuss the various contours of IP and what it means for startups and small businesses, we have Dr. Hemang Shah, India Engineering Lead, Qualcomm Technologies Licensing, Tarun Kumar Bansal, President, Sagacious IP, Vasheharan Kanesarajah, Head of Strategic Development, IP Group, Clarivate. Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time out today. If I could come to you, Tarun, first, I'd like to understand from you the awareness level of intellectual property among startups and small businesses, especially, and what can be done to improve the awareness.
So thanks, Ramarco. So as far as I'm concerned and my interaction with a lot of startups and SMEs around the subject of intellectual property is concerned, I have realized that slowly and steadily, especially amongst the startups, the IP scenario or IP awareness is increasing. And the primary reason is because investors are now asking them about IP. Earlier, when investors were not kind of very about IP, startups were also not very savvy about IP. But again, still, I would say around 70% of the IP in India is being created by MNCs. So if you talk about the filings, approximately 65 to 70% of the IP is filed by foreign companies. And if you talk about grant of patents or similar rights, almost 80% of patents are granted to the foreign entities. So situation is still not that good. And when it comes to how you can actually improve it, I would say if it becomes glamorous and there is money in IP, of course, things will improve. As you see that a lot of us want to become doctors, we want to, earlier people wanted to become engineers, and suddenly the money came into startups and everybody wanted to do a startup. So when they started seeing money in it, they started to get in the direction of doing startups, which earlier was kind of a risky business, and parents discouraged their kids to actually go for startups. So in my view, I think it's a similar thing. So once people start seeing money in IP, so somebody created IP and got, let's say, millions of dollars or billions of dollars by selling that IP, by enforcing that IP, or by licensing that IP, I'm sure these kind of stories will automatically create enforcement, the awareness. And second part I want to highlight is to, I mean, make such case studies or make such stories, we need better enforcement. Right now, I think the biggest problem is you cannot really enforce IP that much. You create an IP, and most of our clients think that by creating IP and publishing their inventions in patents, they are kind of putting it out there for competitors to just use it. Rather than creating any protection. So the thinking should be the other way around. It should be that if I actually put it out there, it will actually create a barrier for entry. But right now, because of low enforcement, people think otherwise. So I think awareness is improving, but not improving at the rate it should be. And government definitely has to play a big role. You see China overtook US in terms of IP filings, and they were at our stage maybe not many years before. I think just 15 years before, they were at a stage where India is right now. So they heavily publicized and created awareness. So government played a big role. They actually kind of incentivized their companies to file IP globally, and the incentives were
Mm.
not small amounts. In India, I mean, you might get through some schemes up to $8,000 to $10,000, but in China, I think amounts were in the range of $100,000. So government really need to focus on enforcement, maybe some more incentivization, and overall as a group, I think if we start creating those kind of stories where IP becomes glamorous and it starts generating money for people, I think it will automatically improve.
Interesting. Hemang, I want to come to you next and understand uh, the risks that are related to, lack of IP awareness. If you could throw some light on that.
Sure. See, startups, by their very nature of work, or I would say the foundation of a startup, is someone who is very passionate about a problem. They saw a problem in the market and they realized that, hey, this is a big hole. Either no one is filling it, or if there are existing products or existing solutions, they are inefficient. And so here is their brand new take on either a problem that none of us experienced before, or we identified it as such, or they saw that, hey, here's my approach which will make your lives a lot better. So I work primarily with hardware IoT startups who are innovating on the edge, and so they are innovating in India. So a big requirement, for them is to realize that they are innovating. That's the primary thing, that because of their different take, innovations are bound to arise just because their foundation is such. And if they don't see the value in their own innovations, that is the biggest risk. What also happens is that a number of these startups tend to look at IP as a factor on the cost sheet. They're looking at outflow. Yes, it is a cost. It takes money, whether you talk about filing for IP, or whether it is, say, working with IP firms or law firms and whatnot. But at the end of that activity, what you're generating is an asset. Now, that asset is time bound. If a startup is launching a product today, it's not that they can wake up 2 years later and say, now I'm going to file for all the intellectual property rights associated with that. The nature of intellectual property is such
Mm.
that you have to file for IP at the appropriate time, or else your own work can end up becoming public disclosure against your future IP filings. So, to me, that is the biggest risk, that one, you have to believe that you are creating very valuable assets and they will
Right.
grow over time. The IP rights are protected, at least in India and most countries in the world, 20 years from the date of filing. And the second is, there is a time bound process that you have to follow. So you can't wake up a few years later and say, here's when things improve and be whatever factor you introduce, here's when I go for it. You may have missed the train at that point.
Right, right. Interesting. Vasheharan, I want to come to you next, and I want you to help us understand the kind of advantages that a startup can get by patenting its ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before I jump into that, I mean, I absolutely agree with Tarun and Hemant's comments around that this has to come from top down, right? It's a government push, and we see this in countries where there is good government incentives, like China and Russia, as examples where their organizations are incentivized, or startups are incentivized to protect their IP rights. There's a lot of value in protecting your IP rights, and I think the understanding is increasing. But I think, as Hemant said, the challenge is that IP is still considered a legal vehicle, right? A legal contract. It isn't being seen as an asset class, and particularly among startups. And there is the legal, right, value of protecting your intellectual property, which is to prevent any competitors from moving into your space. These are sort of the obvious scenarios, but also the scenario of, if an investor is involved, I think one of the first questions that are asked now is, do you have protection for your idea? Right? And these are some of the ideas, or these are some of the scenarios that now are becoming much more important, that to be able to engage in a conversation with an investor and to be able to move further down the conversation line, that you've got to have sufficient protection. So barrier to entry is critical. Protecting your assets, the opportunity to commercialize your technology, the opportunity to grow, the opportunity to build on your innovation itself is critical. The other side of thing is when we think about IP, and particularly around the conversation so far, we often just think about patents, right? There are other rights that are critical as well. And when you think of a startup, it depends on the industry, right? If it's high tech or technology driven, absolutely, patents are a must now, and there's tremendous value there. But even if you're not, then there's the concept of a trademark, right? There are trade secrets and stuff which are critical for startups to understand right up front, and to be able to create value around the brand itself, to be able to sufficiently create a distinctive trademark to be able to sort of generate value is critical.
Interesting. Tarun, if I could come back to you, I want to understand from you, and if you could sort of demystify, if you will, for our audience, the importance of IPR in creating brand and wealth.
The IP is actually very big on balance sheets now, and intangibles are kind of adding to a lot of valuation to the large companies. So, as per one of the studies by SEC in US, the top 5 companies with the highest market value currently, including the likes of Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and others. So they have close to 84% of their valuations in intangibles. If you talk about Amazon, for example, approximately $220 billion is for their trademark alone. So can you realize that just one trademark or several trademarks of Amazon, they contribute to $220 billion in value for Amazon. So I would say I think it's a very important asset for any company. So as Hemang already said, that we have to really put it as an asset and not as a cost on the balance sheet. So that's where I think we need to really think. Now, apart from the brand value that IP actually creates, or I talked about brands like Amazon, which are really big, but I would talk about some of the smaller companies as well and how they actually create value using IP. So we were working with this company from UP, and these guys created a very unique ice machine. So the ice, as you know, in US is very popular. Even in minus 20 degrees Celsius, they will actually drink water with ice cubes in it. So ice cubes is a very big market in US, and these guys are operating in India, and they were selling ice machines in India. And they actually got the right guidance. They actually patented their innovation in US, and they had no market in US, of course, because they were just selling in India, but they patented it in US. So now once they patented it in US, and they started to look for licensing partners, so they were able to actually crack a deal which was worth close to $86 million. So it's a huge market, and their innovation was really great. So $86 million is not a cash deal. It's includes multiple things. So that's why I'm saying that IP can really unlock a lot of value. So as Hemang already said, that they are kind of creating IP day in and day out without realizing. But if they actually start protecting it and looking at it as assets, I think they can unlock a lot of value in multiple ways.
Right. Hemang, coming back to you, and you did touch upon this briefly, the importance of securing IPR at the right time, and how the delays can affect business. I want you to sort of elaborate a little more on this, and also for our audience. I mean, a lot of us tend to think that if you're a sort of a large behemoth, if you're a global giant like Google, these things can't really affect you as badly. But uh, there was an incident in Germany, right? I mean, for almost 9 years, they couldn't use the Gmail domain there because it was registered by somebody way back in 2000. So, if you could just sort of elaborate a little more on how time is, important here.
So I talk to the exposure which I have, the startups that I work with, say on a first-hand basis, and these are companies who are, let's say, they're creating IoT products, and their product landscape can cover anything from wearables to GPS trackers. They could cover robotics, drones, it's a wide gamut of things that these startups are creating. Now, these products are not limited to just India. The market for them is actually worldwide. And number of our startups, they I guess they start their operations by thinking that we will target the Indian market first, and then eventually they move elsewhere to other parts of the world. So either they're exporting out of here, or they set up their operations, their I guess subsidiary corporations, whatever it may be, wherever they want to explore their market. So it of course pays to be more cognizant, of what your product roadmap is going to be like, in which countries you will be. Specifically patents, and I would say this for most IP rights, they are territorial, meaning an India patent is valid in India and India only. Now, if you want to enforce your IP rights in some other part of the world, you've got to have corresponding IP rights registered in those respective countries. And we are happy to say that few of our startups have made that journey. They started out of Bangalore or India per se, then they moved to say China for the next level of product roadmap, and then finally now they're now based in San Francisco, where they want to explore the US market. Now along this entire journey, them working with us, because at least here's where I'll give first-hand information, that we share what we practice as a company. That for us, invention starts from day one. You believe in that absolutely, and from day one itself, you are cognizant of where you're headed, both your product roadmap as well as your company roadmap. So in other words, what you've got to do is, from the access to IP experts like we have on this panel is quite open. It's very easy these days. You can set up, and now well, like it or not, but we are used to this virtual world. So you could get the best IP experts wherever they are on a video call. That's quite easy to get it going. Do that, explain what your journey is going to be like, and make sure that you don't leave any open holes. Because if you don't register, if you don't have that, then it could lead to implications that will bite you in the time. And normally when that happens, now imagine the startup which was thinking that, okay, I'm going to be only this small for the first couple of years. And now when it's thinking about a larger market, maybe elsewhere, it's grown in size, it's grown in operations. That's when it really needs that business.
Yeah.
And at that point, you don't want to wake up and say, oh, I wish I'd done that registration when, Tarun or Vasheharan and they all were saying, you don't want to remember them in regret at that point of time. You want to go back in time and say, oh, thanks to these guys, I'm now set.
Right. Vasheharan, Hemang's got us started with a sort of a global outlook, if you will. So I want to ask you that, if you could elaborate for us how IP can in fact boost companies' global competitiveness.
I think in a number of different ways. I think competition now it's a global arena, and that's critical to understand. And in order for it to be a global arena, you've got to have sufficient IP protection globally, and that becomes critical. The other key piece around when we think about IP now is that when we look at patents, and we, as Clarivate, we often work with corporate VCs, or we work with VCs themselves. And what we tend to see is they're on the look for startups, right? And they want to move into a particular territory themselves, and they need to perhaps acquire, license technology in order to move into that. And they're really looking for deep expertise, right? So we had a client, based out in China, and they wanted to maneuver into the UK, for example, for a very specialist piece of technology. And they asked us the question, could you give us an indication of what the startup scene is like and who's actually specializing in this piece of technology, right? All the way from sort of basic research through to who's commercializing it and what pieces of technology is out there. And when you look at it from that perspective, it's almost like an advert, right? The minute you have some IP, it's published, right? You've got the attention of some of the larger corporations who know that you're serious about this technology, that you have credibility, your name's on the document, they know who to get in touch with. It becomes a contact sheet to encourage. And this was a great story where we had, the Chinese organization looking to maneuver into the UK, and they were able to partner with the startup itself. And this is happening. That's just one small example, but this is happening globally. So that it becomes critical there. The other scenario is that, as I was going back to my initial comment, that it is a global arena today. Competition's very fast paced today, and it becomes critical to be able to defend yourself globally, right? Against any competitors that may be looking to utilize your technology in another territory where you may not have any protection. That may not be an important market today, but could be a critical market a few years down the line. Right? We see this in Southeast Asia, for example, where some of the largest corporations haven't looked at protecting their innovation, but today has become a critical territory.
Interesting. Very interesting perspectives there. Tarun, coming back to you, it is often said that inventors are not very good at identifying IP. I want to understand from you, how can this be addressed?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very important point. So apart from your point that inventors are generally not good at identifying IP, I would also like to add one more point to this, that in India, I mean, it's very bad to say, but in India we have little less self-esteem in that sense. Inventors, when we talk to them, even at the large companies, so they think that what we are doing is not world class. So their first thought is that what we are doing is not as equivalent to what European and US counterparts are doing or people in Japan are doing. So I think all this combined leads to a situation where they start disregarding what they're creating, and it is not kind of captured properly. So that's why I think we need to create a system or a proper engine to capture those innovations. I would give you an example of Uber. So Uber, for example, they grew, and they did not have any IP. And they were actually then wondering that what to do. So they acquired some patents, but at the same time, what they did was they started recording all the meetings that were happening in their premises or in their offices, and they set up a team where they actually then scrutinized all the recordings to identify any IP opportunities. So, I mean, people have gone to that extent to actually identify what kind of innovations are being created, because inventors are not good at identifying the IP worthy opportunities. In another example, I would give you an example of an Indian company. So it's a very large jewelry and watch manufacturer, and these guys were actually doing a lot of good stuff, and now they wanted to actually launch some smart watches with the different capabilities like health tracking and other things, and they were doing a lot of interesting stuff there. Now, what happened was they were not creating any IP as such. So they actually invited, for example, that how you can actually create some IP there, and what can you do to encourage the IP development. So we did a very small step. What we did was we created a landscape, and we started identifying the kind of patents different companies across the globe are filing. For example, what kind of patents Casio is filing in Japan, what kind of patents, let's say, Swatch is filing, what kind of patents other leading watch manufacturing companies were filing. And we started actually giving this particular presentation to the inventors sitting there. And when they looked at those kind of inventions, they were continuously jumping out of the chair and saying, is this even patentable? Is this even patentable? We are doing these kind of things day in, day out. So they were not even aware that those kind of things are patentable. So I think it's a proper process where you actually start making inventors aware that what kind of innovations are kind of patentable in your particular space, what other companies are doing. And then I think you have to make it a culture. So when you talk about culture, for example, I'm a vegetarian, right? So if I'm a vegetarian, even if I'm very hungry, so I will not go and eat non-vegetarian food. If vegetarian food is not available, I'll just walk away. So we have to create that kind of a culture in an organization where you are doing anything. So you have to capture it. It becomes a culture. I mean, it's the inherent thing that first you will capture it and let the, let's say, the invention screening team kill it, rather than you killing it at your end, that okay, this is not patentable or this is not IP worthy. The culture should be such that every person is kind of writing it and kind of then giving it to the invention screening team, who will then kill it. And of course, there should be some incentivization, and the organizations have to come up with really unique and interesting incentivization models. So inventors are incentivized to create and generate IP, and they benefit from kind of submitting those invention disclosures and other things. And in this process, we also have to make this invention kind of disclosure capturing or writing process very easy. So sometimes inventors are not very interested in kind of writing it detailed invention disclosure form. So organizations should be very open and flexible. Like Uber, as I mentioned, that they are recording all the meetings and the invention screening committee is screening it. People should allow kind of just sending a video or an audio recording to the invention committee where they can actually screen and then guide the inventors further. So it will take a lot of effort at any organization's end, but if the culture is set up, they will be surprised at what their organization is generating.
And innovators, like you said, need to back themselves a little more, have more confidence, right? Great. Okay.
Right.
Hemang, you touched upon the government's role and how it's been making attempts at improving the IP culture in India by building awareness around it and reducing patent application fees, etc. It had also announced a digital platform for seamless application and capture of IPR. I want to understand what more can the government do to sort of create the culture that we've been talking about here today?
Sure. Now, I'm very glad that you brought this up. And to me, this is the best time for startups to actually think about IP in India specifically, because the government has come up with so many incentives and initiatives for startups and MSMEs. They have a Startup India portal at which you can get the patent and trademark facilitators. So these are folks who can work on your IP rights at pretty much no cost to the startups. The government is footing the bill for those things. There are other bodies, where you can get a lot of, financial support, be it through reimbursement or be it through any other means in which you can get the support for, say, prior art search or for your patent drafting. For example, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, they have a very good reimbursement scheme under their IP initiatives. So I think it's a factor of the government doing a lot more of what it has already done and making sure that the startups are aware about it. And in some sense, I'm seeing this on a first-hand basis. I sit on a lot of these industry bodies such as ASSOCHAM, where we are actively looking at startups as the next ecosystem drivers when it comes to innovation and IP. So we are very happy to see that the government is partnering with such bodies, and it's saying that, hey, you are the touch points. You have a database. Let's say ASSOCHAM has a database of medium and small enterprises. What can it do? How can it improve the messaging? How can it get the messaging across to larger number of people? Because we have such a, diversity of touch points also. There are a number of startups who are very familiar with the Startup India portal. And for our incubation program, so this year when we took our cohort of 12 startups, our application was hosted on the Startup India portal. And through that, what we saw that companies were applying, to our program from, far off areas that we had not seen before. Like we got an entry from Meghalaya, from the Northeast. And these are hardware IoT startups. So it's a very specific area where they also know that, IP is going to be an important part. So these are IP savvy folks who are there across the country. And it's nice to see that the government is doing its part. There are a lot of initiatives at the state level also. And so at some sense, you can talk of, hey, there needs to be a central point where all these initiatives and incentives can be publicized. There is effort being done in those areas too. On the other hand, when it comes to awareness, I think the simplest way to get people more IP aware is by having touch points at colleges, because these are people who are eventually, they're going to make their way into industry or they're going to start their own companies. And nowadays, startups are a very viable career option. There's so many people who are saying that the minute I graduate, or I don't even have to graduate, I can start my own company. But if that IP education is provided to them at that point itself, then that solves your problem, down the funnel. For the other folks who are established, I think it's just bringing them together. And folks like us, I'm very happy your story is doing this, right? Because the reach that you have is amazing. So it's very nice to see that IP is a topic in a platform like yours. So if we do more of these things, I think we'll solve this problem step by step.
Right. For my last question, I'd like everyone's thought. India ranks pretty low on the global intellectual property index. I want to understand how can this be fixed. I mean, there have been ideas today, and like Hemang just mentioned, the whole college aspect of it. But I want to understand from you, how can we improve our ranking on the global intellectual property index? And Vasheharan, if we could start with you.
I think the number one challenge, I think, sort of being outside of India, one of the big questions that I tend to ask is the quality of STEM researchers and knowledge that exists in India. There seems to be a big gap between knowledge versus output through patents, right? And there's a huge gap there, and it fundamentally comes down to the lack of awareness around patents. I absolutely agree that what Tarun had initially mentioned, that it is absolutely growing and the government is doing a lot about this. But there are a number of, I guess, more important steps that need to happen, particularly when you look at the education system. The knowledge of, or the awareness of IP rights is not still fully understood. The difference between an IP right and thinking about IP as an asset is not fully understood, and how to play in the global arena, right? And that should all come at the grassroots, right up front, to be able to teach, new innovators about, how do you play in the global arena, right? What needs to happen? How do you benchmark yourself against your peers, similar startups, similar organizations in other territories, right? And how are they protecting their IP rights? And that's critical to think about. So for me, it's continuing with the government drive, continuing with education systems and creating more IP awareness, but also a critical factor is culture as well, right? And a culture of homegrown innovation. I think that's fundamental. Yeah.
Lovely. Tarun, your thoughts?
I think both of the other speakers have covered it pretty well. The only point I want to add here is that most important thing with any IP right is you get the IP right, but unless enforcement is actually strong, it doesn't work. So one of the things that India should do is actually strengthen the enforcement. Government is doing a lot. They have actually created a separate enforcement system for IP rights. They're getting the right people to be the judges in those kind of courts, and they're simplifying it. But I think it's still far from being the ideal system, or even close to some of the countries that we compete with. So if we really have to improve on the IP index, apart from awareness, by actually having IP at the curriculum level, as well as doing many other incentive schemes and popularizing the success stories and failure stories of people with or without IP. Enforcement is the key that will actually put us at the top of the IP index, or any of those kind of index, because unless we have strong enforcement system, you can have all the IP rights you want, but you won't be able to utilize them to exclude anyone or to make any money. Because even if you have an IP and you expect that someone will take a license from you, unless enforcement is strong, nobody will take the license. They will just practice it. So for any company outside India to actually think about protecting their IP as well as expanding their business based on IP, or Indian company actually getting more IP, enforcement will still remain the key, and government has to do its job to actually strengthen the enforcement.
Right. Hemang, your closing thoughts on this?
I believe it always starts with awareness and being conscious about IP. And one of the ways to solve it is by learning from people who've done it, like follow their best practices. So, as a small example, we've been running our startup incubation program since 2016, and our startups have filed for more than 95 patents, and the list is growing, and they are seeing the value in that. So we distilled that learning that we saw firsthand, and we put that into an IP education app, which will be released very shortly. So that's it's not more of theoretical knowledge, but it's more like, hey, here's practical ways in which you can make it happen. And what that does is, if you make this material actionable, you will have a lot of IP creators. Once you have people who create IP, once they believe that this IP is valuable, they automatically respect others' IP. So that, in my view, is an upward spiral that you want to embark on. So with better IP awareness, And we are having those steps. And I'm very glad that the entire country and all these panelists are agreeing on the same thing, and we are getting there. So if you guys don't mind, maybe once our app is fully launched, we'll announce it, and then it's going to be free for startups and MSMEs. Everyone will be able to access it on the App Store and the Play Store, even on the website. So that's one way to make it happen.
Wonderful. On that note, we'll wrap up today's discussion. Thanks for those wonderful insights, gentlemen. Appreciate you taking the time out.